The morning mist clung to the trees as I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand. That's when I saw her, a massive black bear, standing frozen just 10 feet away. Her amber eyes locked onto mine, filled with something I'd never seen in the wild, desperation. Between her teeth hung a tiny, lifeless cub, its fur matted with blood. My breath caught as she took a hesitant step forward, then gently laid the cub at my feet. The message was clear: help him. Before I could react, she vanished into the forest, leaving me alone with a dying bear cub and an impossible choice. I scooped up the cub, feeling his shallow breath against my chest. His body was cold, one ear torn nearly off, ribs protruding through thin fur. Blood soaked into my shirt as I rushed inside, my training kicking in. Grabbing towels and the heating pad, I worked frantically to warm his tiny body. Outside, shadows moved between the trees, the mother bear watching, waiting. I knew the law said to call wildlife services, but one look at this struggling cub and I made my decision. This was between me, the bear, and whatever forces brought him to my door. The next hours blurred together. CPR on a bear cub wasn't something they taught in medic training, but I adapted. 2 fingers against his tiny ribs, breathing into his muzzle, watching for any sign of life. When he finally coughed, splattering my face with blood, I nearly cried with relief. But the battle wasn't won yet. His breathing remained ragged, his body shockingly cold. I rigged up a makeshift incubator using a cardboard box and heating pad, constantly checking his pulse. Through the window, amber eyes reflected the lamplight. She hadn't left us. Darkness fell, and the cub's condition worsened. His breaths came further apart, his paws twitching in distress. I stayed awake all night, dripping honey water into his mouth, massaging his tiny limbs to keep circulation going. At one point, I glanced out to see the mother bear's silhouette against the moonlit trees, standing guard like a sentinel. My muscles ached, my eyes burned, but I couldn't stop, not when every weak breath from this cub felt like a victory against death itself. As first light touched the cabin, the cub finally opened his eyes, dark pools of confusion and pain. He whimpered when I touched his injured ear, but then did something extraordinary. He licked my finger. That tiny gesture sent a wave of emotion through me. Outside, branches cracked as the mother bear shifted position. She knew. Somehow, she knew her cub had made it through the night. But our fight was far from over. The wound in his side was infected, his body still dangerously weak. I reached for my phone. It was time to call in reinforcements. Dakota's Jeep came roaring up the dirt road before noon. My old friend took one look at the cub and immediately started unpacking medical supplies. "You've got yourself a fighter here," he muttered, examining the infected wounds. Together we flushed the injuries, administered antibiotics, and rigged in 4 for fluids. The cub, now named Timber, fought us weakly, his tiny growls more adorable than threatening. Through it all, we could feel the mother bear's presence just beyond the tree line, watching our every move but never approaching. Dakota shook his head in wonder. "She chose you, man. That doesn't happen." The wildlife officers arrived on day 3, their crisp uniforms out of place in our rugged world. They frowned at the makeshift animal hospital in my living room. "That cub belongs in our facility," the lead officer stated, reaching for his catch pole. My blood ran cold. Their facility meant euthanasia for injured cubs. I stepped between them and Timber, my voice low but firm. "You'll have to go through me first." The standoff lasted minutes before they left with warnings, but we all knew this wasn't over. That night, I slept beside Timber's box, rifle across my lap, listening for any sound outside. For 5 days, Sierra never left. We'd spot her at dawn by the creek, at dusk near the woodpile, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes she'd leave gifts: a freshly caught trout on the porch, a pile of ripe berries. Dakota said it was bear behavior he'd never seen before. "She's thanking you," he whispered one morning as we watched her from the window. Timber was growing stronger now, his wounds healing, his appetite returning. But with each passing day, a new tension grew. How would this story end? Could I really give him back? The morning Timber took his first unaided steps across the cabin floor, we both froze. His legs wobbled, his balance uncertain, but the determination in his dark eyes was unmistakable. He sniffed at the door, then looked back at me. A silent question. My throat tightened. Outside, Sierra stood suddenly alert, sensing the change. Dakota put a hand on my shoulder. "It's time, brother." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We both knew what came next, but that didn't make it any easier. At sunset, we carried Timber to the forest's edge. His weight had tripled, his fur now glossy with health. When I set him down, he hesitated, nuzzling my hand one last time. Then, a rustle in the bushes. Sierra emerged, moving slowly, her eyes fixed on her cub. Their reunion was quiet, just noses touching, a mother's inspection. Then, with a final glance my way, she turned and led Timber into the trees. I stood there long after they disappeared, the forest sounds returning to normal, my shirt damp with tears. That night, back in my empty cabin, I found a single black bear hair on the floor and smiled through the ache in my chest. The silence after Timber left was deafening. I kept turning to check on him, only to remember he was gone. His makeshift bed sat empty, the heating pad still warm. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak of the cabin, half expecting to find him scratching at the door. At dawn, I stepped outside and found fresh paw prints circling the porch. Sierra had come back to check on me too. I poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit before remembering I was drinking alone again. A week later, I nearly tripped over it, a perfect rainbow trout laid carefully on my doormat. No teeth marks, no claws, tears. Just a fresh-caught fish, scales still shimmering. I looked up to see rustling bushes where Sierra disappeared. That fish fed me for 3 meals, each bite tasting like gratitude. Dakota laughed when I told him, "You've been adopted, brother. Welcome to the bear family." From then on, gifts appeared monthly: berries, honeycomb, once even a shed antler. They came with paperwork and handcuffs this time. Unauthorized rehabilitation of endangered species. Read the citation. I stood silent as they turned my cabin upside down, confiscating medical supplies. The lead officer paused at Timber's empty box. "Where is it?" he demanded. I just smiled. "Where he belongs." They left with threats of jail time, but I didn't care. Some laws are meant to be broken. 3 months after Timber left, I bolted upright at 3 a.m., sweat soaking my shirt. In the dream, he'd been calling me. Not with sounds, but with that same desperate energy his mother had shown. I grabbed my boots and flashlight, following some primal pull into the woods. Moonlight guided me to a clearing where 2 familiar shapes waited. Sierra stepped aside, revealing Timber, now nearly her size, but with that same unmistakable torn ear. Timber's once tiny body had transformed into a muscular young bear, but new scars crisscrossed his shoulders. Battle wounds. He sniffed my hand, then gently headbutted my chest, the same gesture he'd used as a cub. Sierra watched from a distance, her posture relaxed. For an hour we sat together in wordless communion before they melted back into the trees. That's when I noticed the fresh claw marks on nearby trunks. Timber's way of saying, "I live here now." Dakota brought them, a nature film team who'd heard the rumors. For 2 weeks, we tracked Sierra and Timber's movements, capturing never-before-seen behavior. The lead researcher kept shaking her head. "He recognizes you. That cub imprinting is one thing, but the mother's tolerance." The footage would later go viral, though I refused to be interviewed. Some bonds defy scientific explanation. Winter came early that year. I was stacking firewood when movement caught my eye. Timber barreling through fresh powder like an overgrown puppy. He slid to a stop at my feet, snow clinging to his fur, and dropped a frozen fish at my boots. Sierra emerged more slowly, her winter bulk making her nearly unrecognizable. We shared that fish by the fire that night, their hot breath fogging my windows before they left to den. Spring brought challenges. Timber, now nearly adult-sized, started testing limits. Raiding my trash, standing on my porch at midnight. The 3rd time I found my screen door torn, I marched outside shouting like I would at a misbehaving dog. He actually sat, ears flattened in bare shame. Sierra watched from the tree line, then gave a sharp huff. After that, Timber kept his distance from human spaces, but still visited weekly at the forest edge. Smoke hung thick that August when the wildfire jumped the ridge. I was evacuating when I saw them, Sierra herding Timber toward the river. Our eyes met across the burning meadow. No time for goodbyes. For weeks I didn't know if they'd survived, until a ranger called about a black bear and yearling seen crossing Highway 89. The description, 1 torn ear, 1 scarred muzzle, sent me to my knees with relief. This morning's gift was different. A single salmon, carefully placed beside a tiny paw print. New life. I smiled toward the woods where shadows moved. Somewhere out there, Timber was teaching his own cub the strange ways of humans. The circle unbroken. The coffee steamed in my hand as I whispered to the trees, "Good job, Papa Bear." The bushes rustled in response. Welcome to the family indeed. 1 year to the day, I found Sierra waiting at my porch at dawn. Her massive frame carried new scars, but her eyes still held that same knowing glint. She sniffed the air as I stepped outside, then turned and lumbered into the trees, pausing to glance back. The message was clear. She wanted me to follow. My boots crunched through frost as we trekked to a hidden clearing where Timber stood beside a young female bear. His proud stance said everything. The family had grown, and I'd been invited to meet the newest member. Hiking near Linville Gorge last fall, I froze when a cinnamon-colored bear cub tumbled across my path. Before panic could set in, a familiar huff sounded from the brush. Timber emerged, now towering over me, and nudged the curious cub away with his snout. We locked eyes for a long moment, wilderness and man, predator and protector roles reversed. Then with a grunt, he led his offspring deeper into the woods, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding. Some bonds transcend species, but the wild always claims its own in the end. Dakota forwarded the wildlife report last month. DNA evidence showed Sierra was over 20 years old, ancient for a wild bear. The scars told her survival story. Poacher traps, territorial battles, harsh winters. Yet she'd broken scientific expectations by tolerating human proximity. The kicker? Timber's DNA matched a famous problem bear relocated from Tennessee years earlier. Somehow, Sierra had chosen the one man who'd understand their struggle. When I read that, I walked to the clearing and left a honeycomb where she'd first brought me her dying cub. It was gone by morning. 3 a.m. last Tuesday, something heavy thumped against my cabin wall. Through the window, I saw Timber's silhouette, full-grown now, over 400 pounds of muscle and wild instinct. He snuffled at the doorframe before placing something carefully on the step. By flashlight, I found a mangled hunter's trap, its steel jaws bent beyond use. My hands shook examining it. Somewhere out there, he'd encountered danger and brought me proof. Not as a gift, but a warning. I slept with my rifle close that night, not from fear of bears, but for what they faced beyond these woods. Autumn leaves crunched underfoot as I followed fresh tracks to the creek. There they were, Sierra teaching 2 cubs to fish while Timber stood guard. His massive head swung toward me, nostrils flaring. One cub imitated his stance comically. When Sierra grunted, they returned to their lesson, allowing me to watch from a respectful distance. This was their world now, their legacy. I backed away slowly when the wind shifted, carrying my scent toward them. Timber's deep rumble followed me home. Not a threat, but a reminder. We're still here, old friend. The nature film's release brought unexpected consequences. Strangers started prowling the woods, hoping to spot the famous bears. I found candy wrappers and selfie sticks littering the trails. Worst was the YouTube hunter who baited an area with donuts. That night, Timber tore through the man's unattended campsite. Not attacking, just making his displeasure known. When the sheriff called me to identify the aggressive bear, I simply showed photos of the illegal bait station. The hunter got fined. Timber got extra apples at our next meeting. Some justice still exists in this world. Deep February snows drove desperate wildlife to my property. One frigid morning, I spotted Timber digging through my compost, his ribs showing through thinning fur. Our eyes met across the yard. Slowly, I placed a bucket of fish scraps near the tree line and retreated. He waited until I was inside before approaching. Through the window, I watched him eat with measured bites, then bury the rest. Not for himself, the next day Sierra and the cubs dug it up. Even in hunger, he remembered his role. That bucket became a weekly ritual until spring greens emerged. The gunshot echoed through the valley at dusk. I came running to find 2 drunk teens laughing over a wounded doe. Before I could intervene, an enraged roar shook the trees. Timber charged from the brush, stopping just short of the hunters. Their faces went white as he stood on hind legs, 7 feet of pure fury. They dropped their rifles and ran. The doe didn't survive, but Timber stayed by her body until I arrived. We buried her together at moonrise, his low moans blending with the wind. Some things even wild hearts mourn. This spring brought a miracle. Sierra appeared with 3 new cubs, her last likely litter at her age. Timber watched protectively from a ridge as the babies tumbled near my boots. One bold cub nipped my shoelace before Sierra scooped it up by the scruff. Their trust humbled me. As they disappeared into golden hour light, Timber lingered just long enough to touch his nose to my palm, a gesture from his cubhood. 20 years from now, his descendants might roam these hills. And if they ever need help, they'll know where to find me. Yesterday, I found fresh claw marks on my trail-side maple high up where only a standing bear could reach. The grooves formed a pattern eerily similar to the scars on my forearm from Timber's cubhood rescue. Coincidence? Maybe. But this morning, a perfect black bear track marked the dirt by my porch alongside something that stopped my breath, a tiny, rain-faded paw print from years ago. The circle continues. The coffee steam rises into cool mountain air as I whisper to the trees, I'm still here too. Somewhere in the pines, branches crack in response. Always watching. Always family. I noticed Sierra moving slower this summer, her once powerful frame now favoring her right side. When she brought the cubs to visit, she let Timber take the lead, a role reversal that spoke volumes. One afternoon, I found her resting in the shade of my woodpile, her breathing labored. Without thinking, I set out a bowl of water mixed with honey, the same remedy I'd used for Timber years before. She drank slowly, her wise eyes locking onto mine with quiet understanding. The cubs played nearby, unaware their matriarch was teaching me one final lesson about dignity in decline. Dakota showed up with a pouch of Cherokee herbs after seeing Sierra's condition. Bear medicine, he called it, willow bark for pain, golden seal for infection. We left the mixture near her favorite resting spot, watching from a distance as she sniffed it curiously. Within days, she was moving more freely, though the years still weighed heavy. Timber began shadowing her constantly, even catching fish and dropping them at her paws. Their bond transcended instinct now. This was conscious caregiving, the kind rarely documented in wild animals. My notebooks filled with observation science would likely dismiss as sentimental fiction. The first frost came early this year. I awoke to find Sierra's final offering. A single oak branch bearing both teeth marks and claw scars, placed deliberately across my doorstep. Her tracks led toward the high caves where bears winter. She paused at the tree line just long enough to look back, her muzzle gone gray, but her posture still regal. No cubs followed this time. I saved that branch, sanding it smooth to hang above my fireplace. Some goodbyes don't need words to be understood. Spring arrived without Sierra. I searched all her usual spots, finding only old scat and flattened grass where she'd once slept. Timber appeared alone at the territory's edge one evening, his demeanor subdued. He approached just close enough to press his wet nose against my outstretched palm, a gesture loaded with shared loss, before vanishing back into the pines. That night, I heard an unfamiliar sound echoing through the valley. Timber's lonesome howl, not quite a bear's roar but something more mournful. Grief sounds the same in any language. With Sierra gone, Timber's behavior changed dramatically. He began patrolling wider territories, chasing off younger males with newfound authority. Yet he still reserved Wednesday afternoons for our clearing visits, often arriving with gifts, a turtle shell, an eagle feather, once even a perfectly intact wasp nest. Dakota theorized he was maintaining human alliances to protect his expanding family. I knew better. These weren't strategic visits. They were check-ins between old friends. His newest cubs learned to keep their distance from me, but their curious eyes told me Sierra's legacy lived on in their instincts. The scream ripped through the dawn stillness, a bear's cry of pure agony. I crashed through brush to find Timber's front paw clamped in a steel-jawed trap, his roars shaking the trees. What happened next defied nature. Instead of attacking as I approached, he went still, watching as I pried the jaws open. His trust in that moment humbled me. The wound took weeks to heal, during which he accidentally destroyed every trail camera in the area. We never spoke of it, but from then on, certain hunting cabins mysteriously lost supplies whenever traps appeared in our valley. Smoke turned the sun blood red when lightning sparked the ridge fire. As flames crested the hill, I spotted Timber herding 4 panicked cubs toward the river. Without thinking, I waded in, creating a human shield against the fire's approach. For one surreal hour, we stood together in rushing water, man and bears, watching the forest burn. When the danger passed, Timber nudged the smallest cub toward me briefly, as if saying, "Remember this face," before leading his family to safer ground. Some bonds forge in moments no camera could ever capture. I noticed the yellow ear tag first. Wildlife Services had marked Timber as problem bear number 47. My blood boiled until reading the fine print. Do not relocate. Research subject. Turns out our story made him famous in conservation circles. The tags tracked his movements, proving black bears could coexist with humans when respected. Still, I caught him scraping at it against trees until months later he arrived tag-free and smug. Even bureaucrats learn not to mess with a bear who's outsmarted them twice. The frantic whimpering led me to a storm drain where one of Timber's yearlings had fallen through rotten boards. As I reached down, Timber appeared like a shadow, his hot breath on my neck. Every survival instinct screamed run, but I held steady, lifting the muddy cub to safety. Timber sniffed his offspring thoroughly before giving me that old familiar headbutt, a gesture unchanged since his cubhood. That night, Dear Meat appeared on my porch. Payment? Thanks? Either way, the message was clear: family looks after family regardless of species. This morning's tracks tell the story: a massive paw print flanked by 4 tiny ones, leading to the old blueberry patch. Timber's muzzle is graying now, but his offspring flourish under his watch. Sometimes at dusk, I'll spot him sitting where Sierra once did, watching my cabin with that same knowing gaze. The circle continues. My journals bulge with 2 decades of observations most scientists would dismiss as fantasy. Let them. Some truths don't need peer review to be real. The coffee steam rises as I raise my mug toward the trees. Somewhere in the shadows, leaves rustle in reply. I noticed them last spring, silver strands mixed into Timber's thick black fur around his muzzle. He moved a little slower now, his once boundless energy tempered by time. Yet when his newest cubs wandered too close to the old hunting trail, he still charged forward with a roar that shook the valley. Age hadn't dulled his instincts. That evening I left extra apples by the creek, watching from a distance as he carefully divided them among his family. Even an aging patriarch provides. The tourist didn't see Timber until it was too late. I heard the scream and came running to find a man backed against a tree, camera dangling from his neck, as Timber stood between him and 2 curious cubs. Not attacking, just holding his ground. I stepped in slowly, speaking in the calm tone Timber knew well. After a tense moment, he huffed and led the cubs away. The shaken man asked, "How did you do that?" I just shook my head. Some relationships take 20 years to build. You don't explain them, you live them. One of Timber's yearlings has developed a habit. Anything left unattended disappears. Hats, tools, once even my favorite coffee mug. Last week, I caught the little thief Red Pod, dragging my work glove toward the woods. Timber watched from the shadows, doing nothing to stop it. When I laughed instead of scolding, the cub froze, then proudly trotted off with its prize. The next morning, the glove reappeared on my porch, chewed but neatly placed beside a pine cone. An apology? A trade? Either way, the message was clear. Even wild things play. Dakota insisted we check Timber's worsening limp. Sedating a 400-pound bear in the wild isn't exactly textbook medicine. But when Timber emerged from the trees that afternoon, he took the drugged fish without hesitation, trust outweighing instinct. We worked fast, removing a porcupine quill buried deep in his paw while Dakota muttered, "This should kill us." When Timber woke, he shook off the grogginess, licked his cubs' worried faces, and ambled away. No thanks, no aggression, just the quiet understanding of creatures who've long since stopped pretending they don't need each other. The new cubs don't respect borders like Timber once did. They raid my compost, nose around the porch, once even tried to follow me inside. Timber corrects them now the same way Sierra once did. A firm nip to the scruff, a warning growl. But I've started helping. When the boldest cub climbed onto my picnic table last week, I roared like a bear. The cub tumbled off in shock while Timber gave an approving chuff from the trees. Some lessons, it seems, take a village, even if that village is just one old man and a wiser old bear. 3 a.m. A thunderous knock shook my cabin door. Not a knock, the sound of a bear standing against it. I opened it to find Timber, rain-soaked and agitated. He turned immediately, looking back toward the woods. I grabbed my coat and followed. Half a mile in, I found her. A young female, her leg mangled in barbed wire. Timber watched as I cut her free, his eyes reflecting my flashlight. She bolted into the night, but Timber lingered, pressing his forehead to mine briefly before disappearing after her. Since when do bears fetch human doctors? I found it by accident. An ancient oak near the creek, its bark scarred by decades of claws. Timber's marks overlay Sierra's older ones, with fresh scratches from the newest generation alongside. A living family record. Running my fingers over the grooves, I felt the years melt away. That evening, I returned with a pocket knife and added my own small notch at the base. Not a claim, but a witness mark. The next morning, fresh claw marks appeared right beside it. History doesn't care what species writes it, so long as the story continues. I'd left the blueberry pie cooling on the windowsill for exactly 3 minutes. Returning to find only crumbs and a guilty-looking cub licking its paws clean, I couldn't even pretend to be angry. Timber appeared moments later, took one look at the scene, and actually hung his head bare version of "I'm so sorry about my kid." For weeks afterward, extra fish appeared at my doorstep. Bear currency for stolen desserts. Some economies transcend species. Winter came hard this year. I spotted Timber leading his family toward the high caves early, his limp more pronounced in the cold. At the tree line, he paused just as Sierra once had and looked back. Not at the territory, not at the food sources. At me. Then he vanished into the swirling snow. The woods feel emptier this winter. Not just because bears sleep, but because I know our visits grow numbered. Time comes for all creatures, wild or tame. Last night, I dreamed of her, Sierra in her prime, standing proud in the clearing. Not a memory, but something more. Timber stood beside her, young again, both watching me with those impossible amber eyes. No sounds passed between us, yet the message rang clear: the cubs remember. The land remembers. I woke with tears drying on my face and something pressed against my cabin door, a perfect black bear tooth on a leather cord. Gift? Dream? Does it matter? Some bonds outlast flesh. Some stories outlive their tellers. The coffee steam rises. The trees whisper. And somewhere in the high caves, an old bear dreams of the man who helped raise him. The circle remains unbroken.